British abolition of slavery. Why did they abolish it? In this video, I refute the claims of this TikToker at the Transcending, who rehashes the discredited Williams thesis pertaining to British abolitionism. I play his original video first, which is about 1 minute, condensed for time. The refutation follows immediately after.
Which was the first nation in the world that abolished slavery? The first nation in the world to abolish it. It was started by William Wilberforce, was the British. In Great Britain, they abolished slavery.
So England loves to talk about how they were the first country in the world to abolish slavery. And while this is technically true, it's pretty deceptive and definitely self-aggrandizing. As Eric Williams pointed out in his brilliant piece of scholarship, Capitalism and Slavery, England didn't move to abolish the slave trade out of the kindness of their hearts or something. What really happened was the growing aristocratic class in the New World, or the Americas, was beginning to accumulate so much capital from the slave trade that they began to represent a threat to the existing aristocratic class in England at the time. And further, most of these English slave traders and merchants had already made so much money from the triangular trade that they started to invest it in banks and insurance companies. And they saw the abolition of the slave trade as a way to undercut this growing aristocratic class in the New World. In fact, many of these former slave traders turned bankers, of which Eric Williams gives detailed accounts, went on to establish some of the largest banks in the world, most notably the Bank of England and Barclays Bank.
This TikToker at the Transcending is categorically correct that there is deception afoot. However, such deception is coming almost entirely from him. The work he is citing, Capitalism and Slavery by Eric Williams, has not only been heavily discredited by academic critique, but all but refuted by scholarship following its publication. Williams' arguments are an example of confirmation bias. He begins with his conclusion and extracts only those records and quotations that can be appropriated to support it. Roger Anstey's critique in 1968 invalidated most of Williams' reasoning, demonstrating not only the insufficiency of his evidence, but that the greater part of the evidentiary record better supported the recognized humanitarian explanation of abolition in Britain. The Transcending himself seems to contradict one of Williams' central arguments, that being that Britain's prohibition of the slave trade stemmed from the enterprise becoming unprofitable or less profitable. Instead of this, the Transcending claims that existing British aristocracy had come to fear the growing capital accumulation of the slave trade, leading to their support of abolition. This is not historically persuasive. Parts of the established aristocracy were heavily invested in the slave trade and opposed its end. In the 17 years preceding the 1807 bill, abolitionists introduced over 10 such measures into Parliament, only to see them fail each time. Even the crucial 1807 bill received significant resistance, mostly from the House of Lords, including from the Duke of Clarence, the future King William IV. Far more credible a cause for the passage of the 1807 bill, given parliamentary records, was the combination of increasing pressure from abolitionists such as William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson, and a Prime Minister, William Grenville, who was highly sympathetic to the cause. Grenville himself led the charge for the abolition bill in the House of Lords, though even with this endorsement, the support for the bill in the House of Commons still far exceeded its counterpart. The Lords were 3-1 in support, while the Commons tallied almost 18-1 in favor of abolition. Nor should it be forgotten that the bulk of political power in Britain rested with the House of Commons, not the Lords, claiming, as the Transcending does, that abolition came about because a bunch of aristocrats felt threatened that others were growing wealthier than they were, indicates a profoundly naive and limited understanding of British history and its political structure. As Anstey and others clarify, this is not at all to say that economic and national interests did not play a part in abolition, but rather that the impetus and sustained drive for legislation ending slavery, not to mention the century of enforcement afterwards, is far better explained by the abolitionist movement itself, whose unrelenting pressure ultimately won parliamentary favor. This paradigm shift not only reflected a growing abhorrence against slavery amongst British citizenry, but eventually resulted in eradication of the slave trade in African and Arab countries as well, though not without massive costs to Britain and massive resistance from those countries. Other scholars, such as David Richardson or Stanley Engerman, have also rebutted Williams' contention that slavery fueled the Industrial Revolution, or British wealth in general, demonstrating that profits from the slave trade, including the output from the West Indies, comprised at most 1 to 5% of Britain's total economy during any year of the Industrial Revolution. Britain advanced above the rest of the world chiefly due to geographical advantages, but its indispensable brilliance, what allowed British wealth, including its banks, to flourish, came through its legal and political systems, which were grounded in a tradition of impartiality. This elevated London to a global center of commerce, attracting decisive investment and growth. None of this is to excuse or deflect from Britain's participation in the slave trade prior to abolition, nor the terrors of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. But neither should misinformation from ideologues be casually accepted in civil discourse. The Transcending's mention of banks, such as Barclays, is also historically deceptive, given that he is falsely implying that slavery was a primary factor in the success of some or all of Britain's financial system. This is akin to arguing that a doctor is successful in medicine because they took a history class in college. Whatever effect such class may have had, to highlight it as an essential element is not only irrational, but evinces a clear agenda. Unlike the African tribes who enslaved and sold other Africans to Europeans, Britain's economic might depended far less on slavery, as Richardson's and Engerman's figures demonstrate. Moreover, David Barclay, an early partner in the bank, was not only a staunch abolitionist, but spent thousands of pounds freeing slaves on his Jamaican estate, resettling them in Philadelphia. But here's the real kicker. Even if the Transcending's implications were true, which they are not, given his failure to do his homework on the Williams thesis, his argument remains untenable. He's exploiting the gullibility of an audience that has modern ethical sensibilities, hijacking those sensibilities and applying them to a past which had starkly different sensibilities. The same logic would support going to Nigeria and telling the Nigerians, hey, I realize you have accomplished a lot in your society, but your ancestors sold slaves. Therefore, I'm going to misrepresent or belittle your accomplishments so I can feel morally superior to you. I'll also smirk smugly so you know that I have a strong argument. No part of this egotism is remotely appropriate, nor does it carry any validity in reason or ethics. For the majority of human history, slavery was a global phenomenon sanctioned by legal, moral, and religious customs. The fact that the institution had a massive effect in shaping history, including into the present, in no way diminishes Britain's historic feat in stamping out the overwhelming bulk of slavery in the world, with the majority of its efforts not being tied to any economic or material benefit for itself. To minimize or deny this significance, especially when doing so under the guise of a sanctimonious pseudo-intellectualism, goes far beyond intellectual dishonesty. It starts to border on malice, not to mention damaging legitimate scholarship and propagating a distortion of history. The moral outrage that preceded and sustained the abolitionist movement in Britain was and remains to this day a momentous global achievement. It cannot and should not be minimized or denied, and it is the height of irresponsibility and deceit to do so.